Congressman, we so appreciate you taking the time to talk with us again. We had a group with you 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Okay, let's, who's going to introduce the group? Okay.
Congressman Cole, thank you for seeing us. We are the 11th and 12th grade students at Mount Madonna School. We have a couple questions prepared for you, but if you have any opening remarks, we would love to hear those first.
No, let's just, let's start in with your questions.
All right.
Hi, I'm Noah. So, in an interview with Mount Madonna School in 2016, in response to a question about your career path, you said, "So it's just been a series of accidents. Not planned, but you know, when the Lord opens a door, you walk through it sometimes. And it worked out well for me." Can you speak a bit more about the power of saying yes to unexpected opportunities?
Yeah, no, I think it's actually one of the crucial things you have to do. Again, I thought I had a set path in life. I was going to be an historian. I was on that path. I loved history. I still love history, and got my doctorate. But you know, when all of a sudden, and I didn't even know it was an opportunity. It was, you know, I got into this to make sure my mother would win an election, and then I found out I liked it. And all of a sudden, other people started asking me to do it. And then finally, when I told somebody, "No, I don't have the time," he said, "Well, I'll pay you." And I thought, well, okay, I could do it for money. And then ended up stumbling into a full-time position, and there was always another position after that. But I do think, you know, you sort of have to follow your gut on something like that. I mean, you don't do it for the money. You do it because you got into it and you found out it's something you really like. And honestly, I always joke I probably was better at politics than I ever was as an academic historian anyway. So, but I think you always have to be open to opportunity or change. And that's been true inside politics too. I mean, I really, before I ran for Congress, I would have told you my days as an elected official were over. You know, I was a consultant, I worked with other candidates, and by, again, series of happenstance, all of a sudden the opportunity presented itself. And each time there was an opportunity to go forward, it quite often meant a step back, particularly financially. When I became chairman of the Republican Party in Oklahoma, I already had a good staff position with the congressman, and it meant a pay cut from $43,000 to $25,000 a year, plus loss of benefits. And I had a wife and a child. And so probably wasn't the smartest financial move I ever made, but it was one of the most important political moves later on. Same thing, Congress. I made a lot more money before I was in Congress than I make today. I wouldn't trade it for anything. I mean, I think this is an enormous privilege to get to do what I do. So, you know, sometimes opportunity always comes with some sacrifice. It's not just everything's going to be better. Either you have to move, or there's some work involved, or maybe a step back, so you think you get an opportunity to step forward. But I think you have to weigh those things out. You have to be prudent about them. I'm not reckless in my decision making, but I've always been optimistic about what the future was, and I've been willing to take a chance, and I think that's a good thing to do in life.
Hi, my name is Emily. In an interview with OU Daily, you talked about how you originally planned to be a historian, but made a promise to your mother that led you to run for Congress many years later. Can you talk more about the promise you made her?
Yeah, absolutely. My mother was a really gifted politician in an instinctual kind of way, and she grew up in difficult circumstances. She grew up with a single mother, father. Just draw you into more Indian stuff than you want, but back then it was pretty common for white men to marry Indian women, get the land, and then divorce them. And that's exactly what happened to my grandmother. So my mother ended up being raised by a single mother in Depression era Oklahoma, which was pretty tough. But she ended up marrying my dad and traveled all over the world in the military sense, not in a splendid sense. I mean, he was a master sergeant. And she was instinctually political, and she's from a political family. Her grandfather had been the treasurer of the Chickasaw Nation. And so the families have been involved in politics, in Indian politics, a long time. So but as she traveled, she came to the conclusion, wherever there were two competitive parties, you know, things were better. Government was more transparent, it was more open. If people were corrupt, they could be kicked out of office. And so she decided that she had grown up in a one-party state, because Oklahoma was all Democratic back then. She would get active in the minority party, which was the Republican Party, if we ever retired. And my dad did retire. We moved back to Oklahoma, and she started being just a volunteer. Just would knock on doors, hold coffees, do things. And she did it for 16 years. She was a party official. She helped other people get elected. And finally, in 1976, she was talked into running for the state legislature. And in 76, I was going to the University of Oklahoma. I was a graduate student and, pursuing my dissertation. And if you know much about graduate students, they're the most self-absorbed people in the world. I mean, they are focused on the prize, which is getting that degree and getting the dissertation done or the bar exam or whatever it is. And so she ran a good race, and I did a few things, but I didn't do very much. And she lost in November very narrowly. And it was a heavily Democratic seat. And I remember the worst place to be on the planet is your mother's watch party the night you lose and you haven't done much. I mean, the guilt is overwhelming. And I felt terrible. But I'd watched the campaign enough to figure out the problem had been, true with a lot of first-time candidates now that I've done this stuff for a lot of years, they try to be both the manager and the candidate. And you really can't do both. Candidates need to be candidates, and you need somebody to take the day-to-day organizational stuff off you, so you're meeting voters and you're doing all the things candidates need to do. And so I told her that, and I said, if you run again, I think you could win, and I'll manage it. I'll learn how to do this. I never in my wildest dreams thought she would do it. I would have never made that promise. But about 14 months later, I was in London. I was on a Fulbright fellowship, and she got in touch with me and said, I'm running. When are you coming home? And we laughed. She knew I was coming back in June of '78, which was just about when the political season was kicking off. And I came back. I was teaching European history courses at the University of Oklahoma. I went down to talk to my department chair and my dissertation director and told them, look, I'm going to teach the courses because I need the money, but unless you have a strenuous objection, I'm just going to set aside my dissertation. And they were actually very understanding about this, which I appreciate. And I'm not going to do anything until November because I'm going to work this race. Well, that time she won. And again, it wasn't me, it was just letting her be the candidate she could be. But I found in the process of doing that I really liked running campaigns. How many of you guys are in athletics of some sort? Okay, if it's a team sport, when you're in a locker room after a game, win or lose is a lot like being at a watch party, an election. I mean, you've fought for something in common, you've bonded together, you've worked for something, and and there's a day of reckoning, there's a score, there's a game. And I'd been an athlete as a kid in college and high school, and I liked that kind of stuff. So I just, again, started doing it for fun. And but it was really, had my mother won the first time, or had I been wise enough not to promise her what I would do and then feel compelled to do it, I probably wouldn't be in politics. I'd probably be teaching at North Dakota State or something in British history. So that was it. Nothing magic.
Hi, I'm Carl. I have a follow-up to that.
Sure.
So, what are some qualities that made your mother such a good politician that you try to emulate in your work?
First, empathy. She had a deep understanding of people, and she cared about people a lot, one-on-one. Second, pragmatic. She was an extremely pragmatic person. She saw the world the way it is, not the way she wanted to be. She saw people the way they are and not necessarily the way she wanted them to be. So she was pretty instinctually shrewd. Third, she had a strong set of values. I mean, she believed in certain things, not just ideologically, but personally as well. People liked her. We used to joke, her real political base was when we moved to a little town where I still live, but it's not little anymore. When we moved there in 1960, it was about 1,700 people. I'm called Moore, Oklahoma. Today it's about 70,000. But she went to work about a year after we were there as a bank teller, and she was the first drive-in window teller in Moore, Oklahoma. Well, guess what? You meet everybody if you're the drive-in windows. And you've got chiclets for the kids, and you've got dog biscuits for the dog, and and so that became her power base. But she was very good with people. People liked her. She was outgoing. She had, she was active in all her communities, active in her church, active in the local Chamber of Commerce. But the bank job really gave her this base. But her qualities, again, were empathy, pragmatism, and values. And she just had a deep interest in public affairs. She really, I don't know where that came from, family-wise. Again, the person, her stepfather, who married my grandmother, was a career naval officer and fought in the Pacific. Her brother, my uncle that I'm named after, was a Bataan Death March survivor and a Japanese prisoner of war. So she, like a lot of that greatest generation, grew up in that kind of environment where politics was very, very real. And depression, war, see family members in service, you see all the challenges associated with that. And then a military family, and in the Cold War era, which is what my mom and dad were, and my brother and myself. Politics was just something we talked around the kitchen table about a lot. She was intellectually gifted and never had the same opportunity she made sure I had or my brother had. So, but politics just became the outlet for this curiosity, this energy. Again, she was very, very good at it.
Hi, I'm Priyanka. As a former history professor and member of the Congressional History Caucus, you must have a very good understanding of our nation's past. What values do you think are important in our government that transcend the limits of time?
Well, first of all, I think the first thing is you have to remember, what our government, why it began. And the founding fathers had a tremendous fear of concentrated power, and everything that you see around you is meant to make it difficult to get anything done. We don't have a king or an emperor. We have a president, and he's limited in terms. We have two different houses, and legislation has to go through both and signed by the president. They're elected on different cycles. So, first is this: never let too much power be concentrated in too many places. As a matter of fact, I would tell you that's what my mother was. I used to call her a Lord Acton Republican. Lord Acton's the one who coined the very famous phrase, "Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely." And she would have believed that. She saw a one-party state as too much power. I think our founders looked on government that way too. And then, the other thing I would say is you have to remember the Bill of Rights and where that comes from, the sense that we don't get our freedom from government, we get it from God. We have inalienable natural rights. I think those things, a limited Republican form of government maximizing individual liberty, but recognizing there has to be a center, a sense of order for governance sake is the hallmark of the country.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, my name's Samith, and I was wondering, what are the main challenges today as Deputy Major Whip in coordinating your party?
If you'd have been on the floor today, you'd have seen one. We crashed and burned on the farm bill. Probably this is a very raucous and diverse Republican conference. People don't think of Republicans as being diverse, but this is actually the second largest majority Republicans have had since 1928. So it's actually a much bigger group of Republicans than we're used to dealing with. So that's problem number one. And it stretches from very, very conservative places to, sort of very moderate, upper income, highly educated suburbs. So they look at the world differently in, let's say, Northern Virginia than they do in rural Alabama or rural Oklahoma. So you've got those kind of differences. And then when we retook the majority in 2010, let me back up. When I got here in 2002, we actually had a smaller majority, but we were more successful legislatively. We moved as a team more. And politics is, in essence, a team sport. No individual member of Congress can do anything by him or herself. They have to do it as a majority in a legislative body. So if you can't work as a team, you really can't govern very well. And so when I got here, actually, we were joining what we considered, and I got here in 2002, a very successful team. It had been a Republican majority that had balanced the budgets, that had reformed welfare. We had had 9/11, and President Bush had responded well. This is pre-Iraq. That happens a few months after I arrived here. And so the sense was, wow, we're joining this great governing team. And so members, Republican members that were freshmen, were very loyal and tended to vote with the team. The group that made the majority again in 2010 is a very different group. It ran against the Democrats, and it certainly ran against President Obama, but it ran against the old Republican Party too, because it thought it had failed. The budgets were unbalanced, we're in an unpopular war. So there's a group with a pretty hard edge, Freedom Caucus guys, and there are about 40 or 50 of them, and they're enough to keep you from getting to be in the majority. And so it's a much more difficult process to manage. I would tell you this is true in the country. It's going to be true on the Democratic side. It's easy to be united in opposition because you're just voting no. The real hard part comes when you're governing. Because you've got to be united, and different people have different opinions. But if you look around across the country, it's much more difficult to put together governing coalitions than it used to be. Republicans are the red parts of America are redder. Let's put it that way. The blue parts are bluer, so the two parties are further apart. There's not much. You can't capture very many Democrats with a Republican initiative or Republicans with a Democrat initiative. So you've got to have unity within your team, but there's lots of strains inside our caucus. So number one problem is managing it, getting people to talk to one another, getting them to understand that, hey, you're never going to get everything you want here. You can move in the direction that you want or not, but if don't make the perfect the enemy of the good. Just, in football parlance, and if you're from Oklahoma, you talk football all the time, but settle for first downs. You don't have to throw into the end zone every play. Just keep the ball moving, and we have some people that have a hard time accepting that. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Ruby. In a previous interview with our school, you spoke about the recent growth of Republican Congress, saying, a lot of members came with, frankly, no previous experience in government. There are certainly some that were legislators, but a lot of them, this is the first public office they ever held. Lately, there's been a lot of talk about draining the swamp and anti-insider rhetoric. Can you discuss the pros and cons of bringing relative outsiders into high positions of power?
Well, the pros are you come with no baggage, no commitments, no history of positions. Maybe you can look on things with a fresh eye, although the reality is if you run a campaign, you've taken positions because you've answered questions. Voters have asked you about different things. The cons, to me, outnumber that. I've seen some people that get here that are very good, that have never been in politics before, but honestly, not many. It helps to have been in the state legislature or some other body to understand. We have a lot of people on my side of the aisle that will come here and think government's a business. It's not. That's not the way it works. In a business, you hire and fire, and you're the chief executive. If you're a member of Congress, the only people you hire and fire are your staff. You can't fire the other members. I remember saying that with all due respect about Donald Trump when he became president. Presidents can't look at senators and say you're fired. And you're going to need them tomorrow because they confirm all your appointments, so you got to have them to move things through. So it's much more an art of negotiation, and people that have been in government sort of get that. It's also a matter of, you represent, most people represent pretty diverse constituencies. I represent 700 and almost 50,000 people. My district's a little bit larger than the average. Okay, I always tell people, in that district, I've got 14,000 farms and ranches, over 20,000 producing oil wells, 2 huge military installations, largest air depot in the world, the home of the field artillery, 11 Indian tribes, 5 colleges and universities, about every decade the best college football team in America, We produce more tires than any congressional district in America. We're number 7 in the number of horses per district. In other words, it's really big and it's really diverse. And understanding that you represent all these constituents, including the people that didn't vote for you. A lot of people that get here sort of think the only people they represent is the people that voted for them, and particularly if they only won a primary. You've got to think much more broadly than that. And again, people that have been in government at different levels, there's the political process and there's the governing process, and they're linked, but they're not identical. Running a campaign is one thing. A lot of people, if I'm running a campaign in my district, Tinker Air Force Base, that's Tinker Air Force Base, and Fort Sill Army Post is Fort Sill, can't participate in the campaign. They're federal installations. But what happens at those places, since Tinker employs 20,000 civilian or 16,000 civilian workers, and Fort Sill 4,000 to 6,000, is pretty important. So I better learn something about them. So you have to broaden yourself beyond your campaign experience and begin to understand, who are the people I represent, what are their interests, and how do I actually work, on their behalf. So it's a very different process.
Hi, I'm Indigo. In an interview with Mount Madonna School, you said, "When I got here in 2002, there were a lot of Democrats in my part of the world. Now they're all Republican." So you see a polarization, geographic as well as ideological. How do you think this geographic as well as ideological polarization is affecting the way policy is being made in Washington today?
I do see a polarization, and that's a very astute question. And it's what it really does impact the governing process. A lot of people will believe that division begins up here and spreads into the country. It's exactly the opposite. The division is in the country, and it comes to a point up here. And I'll give you an example. Again, when I got here, to pick up on your point, my state still had a Democratic congressman. Arkansas, right next door, had 3 of the 4, and both senators were Democrats. They're all Republicans now. Kansas was split. It's all Republican now. There are Democrats north of Dallas. They're all Republican now. That whole area has become incredibly Republican. By the same token, when I got here, California was the largest Republican delegation. You think of blue California. There were 24 Republicans in California. There's 14 today, and there would probably be fewer after the next election. Connecticut, 3 of the 5 members were Republicans. They're all Democrats today. And we've had wave elections since then. We weren't able to reclaim anything in Connecticut, for instance, or much in California. So, it really is a situation where the country has become geographically and culturally more divided. One of the interesting things, and it even gets into your social life, in the 2016 election, there was a poll in Virginia. And Virginia was, it leans a little blue, but it's a competitive state. A lot of Republicans in Virginia. And 60% of the people who voted for Hillary Clinton said they didn't know a single person who voted for Donald Trump. And 54% of the people who voted for Donald Trump said they didn't know a single person voting for Hillary Clinton. Now, that can't be true. But I'm in Alexandria. I live in Alexandria right now. And I can tell you certainly wouldn't put out a Trump yard sign if you live in the People's Republic of Alexandria. It's that Democrat. But you probably wouldn't put out a Hillary Clinton yard sign down in Roanoke either, in coal country, in Trump country, in Virginia. And so even people that are in the minority sort of feel, whether it's either way, that they can't speak out or they'll be socially ostracized. That's a really unhealthy thing in a democracy. And this regionalization and polarization, and it's both things happening, is really bad for the country. I don't have a Democratic congressman that lives within 200 miles of me in any direction. That means the people in that whole area aren't going to hear that point of view very often. They're not going to be exposed to that kind of debate. The most serious race I have now is in a primary. That was very different than when I elected. The serious race was the general election. Now you would worry more about a primary in my district because it's so solidly, President Obama ran twice won 2 national elections, he didn't carry a single county in Oklahoma either time. That's how red that area is. So that means you're not hearing dissent. You're not hearing another point of view. You're not having an argument or a debate. That's, I think, bad. And I think then members come and they reflect that too, which makes it very difficult for them to deal. The other thing I would tell you is the country, and I saw this when President Obama was there, I see what President Trump is there now. You're not rewarded for compromising. You know, everybody says, why can't you guys work together? When we do work together, you get punished by your electorate. They don't want you. I was talking to a friend of mine who's a Democrat who's now in the Senate that I served with in the House. I won't use the name, but the individual said, boy, when given the state you represent, the tax cut might have been a good vote for you to make politically. I mean, if you don't believe in it, obviously. And the individual said back, politically it would look that way, but you have to remember, and it would help me with the Republicans and the sort of independence that I need in a red state to put together with Democrats. But 80% of the people that I have voted for Hillary Clinton, and they hate Donald Trump, and they will not, if they think I'm dealing with him in anything, then I get punished. And you see that how much struggle there is in the Senate just to get what should be pretty routine appointments done. And that was true when the Republicans, with Barack Obama. One of the great compromises of the Obama era was something called fiscal cliff, which it was to make most of the Bush tax cuts permanent. Not all of them, but it made about 85% of them permanent for about 98% of the American people. That should have been an easy yes vote for a Republican. I certainly voted for it. And it was a compromise between the two parties. But it did raise taxes on the very wealthy, people that make over $400,000 a year. We had 151 Republicans in the House of Representatives vote no. Now, if that had not passed, you would have had a major tax increase. Somebody that made $50,000 a year would have had a $2,200 income tax increase. So big hit on a rather modest income. And yet, if you can't argue that and go home, people said, but it's raising taxes on some people, so I'm voting for a tax increase. You really weren't, because everybody's taxes were going up if you didn't pass this compromise. So again, the regionalization and polarization has made it very difficult to work across the aisle in this era, much more difficult than it was when I arrived here. It's gotten worse every year. There's a National Journal study that measures the overlap between the two parties, and they've been doing it for about 30 years. In other words, is the most conservative Democrat, more conservative than the most liberal Republican? And that used to be the case. There were a lot of conservative Democrats when I first got here. There aren't any now. I mean, there's a couple, but they're mostly gone. And there are a lot of moderate to liberal Republicans in the Northeast. They're all gone. So if you look at the parties, they used to be like this, and there was an overlap between the two here, and now they're like this. Today, the most liberal Republican is more conservative than the most conservative Democrat in the House, and vice versa. So it's made it much more difficult to piece together bipartisan deals. And when you do, you get condemned for them. We just had a major deal on spending that funded the government for this year, gave the Republicans a big increase in defense spending, gave Democrats some domestic spending that they were interested in. It was a trade-off, and the bill passed by 145 Republicans in the House and 111 Democrats voting for the same bill, and Donald Trump signing it. And everybody got condemned. The Democrats for giving in, and the Republicans for spending too much. So it's a tough era when voters tell you they want you to work together, but then condemn you when you compromise. And they do. And they do it on the left and the right, and they did it under Obama, and they're doing it under Trump.
Hi, my name is Sage, and we recently interviewed former Secretary of State George Shultz.
Wow, I wish I'd have been there for that. What a cool guy.
Yeah, and he spoke about how trust and accountability are very important values to our country. Do you think that what we see in the media is just spotlighting deficiencies in our country for the sake of getting viewers? Or do you think that trust and accountability are actually diminishing in the public sphere? And if so, how do you think we can address this?
I do think trust and accountability are diminishing. I'm not one that goes out and blames the media per se, although, you know, if you look at it, look, news is usually conflict, and so I understand that. But I do think the country works better than most people think it does. And I do think that it wouldn't hurt every now and then to highlight areas when people agree. Again, we've had a lot of contention in this Congress. Most people don't know that this Congress has done more on human trafficking than any Congress in American history, and it's been very bipartisan, as you would expect. I don't care where you are on the political spectrum, there's not much worse than trafficking in human beings, quite often minors, quite often for sexual exploitation. This Congress has done more on veterans than any Congress, and frankly we've done that for a number of years under both presidents of both parties, no matter who, because people honor people who serve. This Congress has made a major commitment to rebuild American defenses, and that's been a Democratic and Republican commitment with some trade-offs involved. So, you know, when people actually agree or say something good, there ought to be a highlight on it. And I do think sometimes the media only covers conflict, and it covers the most sensational and the easiest stuff to cover. I remember once appearing on a morning show, and there was we just signed $1 trillion compromise spending bill, and instead they wanted to talk about, and you know, the journalist on the show didn't even realize we'd done it. They wanted to talk about the fight over health care. This was back in the repeal and replace time debate on Obamacare. And I said, well, that's great, but I want to talk about this. Here's a place where we just had the biggest initial compromise of it was early in President Trump's term. We've got Trump and Republicans and Democrats in the House sitting down and passing $1 trillion bill that keeps a government shutdown from occurring, and where each got some trade-off. And it was, oh, really? You just extended it for a week? I said, no, this was a whole big, the guy didn't even know we'd done something of that magnitude, was focusing on something else entirely. So, you know, government is complex, to be fair, and but sometimes the media, again, looks for the conflict. In terms of trust and accountability, there's a little bit more trust than you might think in the body. I mean, you figure out pretty quickly up here who you can trust. I always tell people Congress is a lot like a small town. I mean, everybody in a small town knows who tithes at the church. Everybody knows who gives to the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts and the local baseball team. Everybody knows who'll loan you their lawnmower. Everybody knows who'll bring the lawnmower back. I mean, it doesn't take long to figure out in a group of 535 people who keeps their word and who doesn't. So, and your word is very important in the legislative process. People need to know where you're going to be and that they can count on you if you commit. And that's one of the unpardonable sins up here, if you commit. And then if you have to change, that's okay, but you got to go tell the person that something has happened and I'm changing and this is the reason. So, you know, George Shultz, one of the wisest men in public life in my lifetime, and he's right, the erosion of trust and accountability is a big problem for us. And the unwillingness to, you know, I'm a Methodist, and I'm trying to remember the exact words. It's an old Wesley saying, differences that begin in points of opinion seldom terminate there. How unwilling men are to grant anything good in those who do not in all things agree with themselves. In other words, people take disagreement. If you disagree, you're evil. No, I just disagree. Doesn't mean they're not a good spouse, doesn't mean they're not a good parent, doesn't mean they're not a nice person, doesn't mean they're not fun to spend. So just because you have a disagreement doesn't mean you're evil. Actually, most politicians understand that intuitively because they're working in small groups. But at home, you know, they're watching this through this lens, and they can't understand, well, how could you get along with X or Y? Because I see them on television, my gosh, they're terrible. No, they just disagree with you. They're really nice people. Most of the time, people are nice. And they always ask people, when I used to go to college campuses, well, I still do, I mean, how many of you in this classroom would vote for somebody that you didn't agree with on everything, but you thought was a good person and trying to do, and all the hands go up. And then I asked, how many people would you vote, how many of you would vote for somebody you don't like? Well, nobody's hands go up. Well, politicians do win elections, so they must be likable people. And for the most part, they actually are when you meet them one-on-one and spend much time with them. And they've got all the same problems and strengths and weaknesses that everybody else has. But they're generally pretty nice, because jerks don't stay elected very long.
Hi, my name is Gracie. From our research, we've noticed that you have the ability to understand the complexity of an issue and the willingness to take a stand, even in the face of partisan pressure. Given what we read about current polarization of the Congress, how do you walk the line between your conscience and constituents when those two are not in agreement?
That's a very good question. Most of the time, you do agree with your constituents, or you wouldn't be here very long. I mean, you can't consistently be at odds with them. If you are, then they can and should remove you. I mean, they should have somebody that generally. So I think I know my district very well. I mean, my family's lived in my district 170 or 80 years, so we've been around there for a long time. So I think I understand the people in it, the values and the interests. But there are those occasions where you do disagree, and usually you think you're representing their interests and they don't know what their interests are. And that's a high-risk proposition. As a matter of fact, my dad used to put it, my dad was a career soldier, and I remember asking him once when I was very young, I said, Dad, how do you be a successful soldier? And he said, it's quiet for me, he said, just remember you only need to win the Medal of Honor one time. In other words, don't go out there every day and try and get killed. So if you're going to differ with your constituents, it better be on something really big. If it's just a routine thing, it's not that big a deal. But if it's something that's important, then you've got to go to the mat. And in my case, one of those instances was on something called TARP, the Trouble Asset. It's basically the bank bailout in the Great Recession. And I became convinced, it wasn't where I wanted to vote, and our calls were running, 14, 15 to 1 against voting for this quote-unquote bank bailout. Although in the end it wasn't a bailout at all. The federal government actually made money because we loaned money to the banks. They had to pay it back with interest. So we made $40 or $50 billion off the transaction of it by the end of it. But it was very unpopular. But I became convinced, and I was in Republican leadership at the time, so I was meeting with the Secretary of the Treasury, and I was reading with the head of the Federal Reserve, and talking to all these guys. And then I started getting signals at home what was happening to the credit markets, and I became pretty convinced that if we did not act, that we really would have something like the Great Depression. I mean, what happened was bad enough, but something like a Wall Street crash that really destroyed the financial system. And so in the end, I voted for it. I voted for it twice. The first time it failed, the second time it succeeded. And what I did was put out a statement right away. Back then, the largest newspaper in the state, sadly don't have it now, but it had representation up here. I did a video interview with them. I went home and I went to every place I could go, every newspaper. This is why I did this. This is what was at stake. This is what the consequences were. I'd lived through an oil bust in Oklahoma that was about like a depression someplace else. And I'd heard discussions of the Great Depression my whole life from my parents and grandparents and what it was like. And I was convinced that we had to do something, and if we didn't, that would be it. And so you have to put their interests first, even when they have a different view, and then you've got to go back and be honest with them why you did something. I ended up getting a primary over it, and it's still something that bothers some people that normally would be supportive of me, but I'm comfortable I made the right decision. In the end, that's what you got to do. But the stakes need to be high. If you're gonna not vote with your people, you don't just do it to tweak them. It's got to be something that really matters or means something, beyond their views. Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'm Zach. On your website, you said, without question, education is one of the most important building blocks for success, and access to quality learning directly impacts lifelong development and individual potential. It seems that most people understand the importance of education, yet as a nation we don't seem to put enough resources behind our teachers. We know Oklahoma recently has been trying to address this issue. What can we do to support teachers and their invaluable work?
Well, quite a bit. And actually, we do put a lot of resources. Per capita, we put more money than anybody else in the world does. So you have to look at what's going on in our structure and our culture that we're not getting better results. But look, my son is a public high school teacher, and so I have a strong vested interest in them being well paid, because if they're not, I will be on the hook, I suppose. You know, again, I think you have to value it for what it's worth, and it's worth a great deal. Now, most teachers I know aren't in it for the money, you know, because you can make a lot more money doing something else. You've got to be in it because you love to educate kids, and you love to be around young people or college-age kids or whatever you want, whatever it is. Again, if you don't pay enough to get really decent people doing that, if everybody teaching is in the bottom quarter of their graduating class, then what kind of opportunities are you going to provide for students? So again, there's a variety of ways to address this issue. You know, most local funding, or most funding for education, K through 12, is local. I mean, the federal government does do about roughly 8 or 9% of that budget, and we try to categorize it in certain areas that will either help disadvantaged kids or help kids that have disabilities or things like that, things that are very difficult to do locally. So it's targeted. But, you know, again, it gets down to people understanding how important this is to their future economically, to the future of their children, obviously individually. But society that doesn't educate its young people isn't going to be very competitive with anybody very long. If you're my age, you know, I ain't gonna be working that much longer, so I have to count on all you guys to take care of me. So it would really be good if you were really well educated and very successful. You know, again, and we've generally been a leader at that, you know, in global history. But this may be the first generation that is not the best educated generation in the world. You know, and most other generations have been, they weren't as well educated as your generation will be, but they were better educated than anybody else in the world. That's not going to be true if we're not really careful. We don't have and that doesn't mean every kid has to go to college, but every kid needs some post, you know, high school experience. One of the things we grapple with, you're actually in a room, this is the hearing room for the Labor H committee that I chair. So the entire education budget of the federal government runs through this room. It's $70-odd billion. So we spend a lot of time in this room figuring out what can we do with $70 billion to you know, improve the education of young people so that we can be competitive. And you know, one of the emphasis now, in addition to traditional college, is to put more money in things like career tech and skills, things like that. I mean, a good plumber can make a lot more money than I guarantee you a first grade teacher. No, just got to do it.
Hi, I'm Cyrus, and lately I've been interviewing veterans primarily from the World War II era, and this year I had the opportunity to turn into a school project and bring a panel of veterans to speak at the school. So remembering their sacrifices and supporting them is very important to me. And so you've stated that the VA is not fully meeting the needs of our veterans, and so what do you think that they should do? What would you advise them to do differently?
A lot. Now, again, they do a lot. And first thing you need to recognize, you're talking about veterans in the United States, is we spend more money on veterans than every other country in the world combined. Not any other, every other. There's not another country in the world that you can have a non-service related injury 30 years after you've left the service and show up at a VA because you're a vet and get taken care of. And we do that because the American people put that great a value on the sacrifice of people that have put themselves in harm's way for the protection of the rest of us. So the commitment here is really great. Now, I would tell you there's several things I would like to do and we're trying to work toward. One is to provide more, it's a very bureaucratic system, provide more flexibility. One of the great reforms the last few years, and we haven't worked it out where it works well enough yet, is veterans' choice. Let's say you live in Oklahoma in a little town, and there's not a veterans center there. And it's 100 miles away to where there is one. You ought to have a card where you can, for routine things, you can just go to the local hospital or the local clinic or whatever and be taken care of. Certain injuries really make a lot of sense to be dealt with. If you're talking about burns or certain kind of body injuries, I mean, you need very specialized care. But if it's a gallbladder, we don't need to drive you all the way to the Veterans Center. We need to make it easier for you to do that. And then, frankly, we have, and Congress has actually done a lot. It's a lot easier to hire and fire in the Veterans Centers than it is now. If you're not getting good care, then we need to be able to fire those people immediately. Look, my dad was, again, career military, spent the last 12 years of his life in veterans facilities. He had Alzheimer's and didn't recognize any of us for the last 11 years. And I got to tell you, he got unbelievably good care. So he'd served his country for 20 years, and his country was there for him, and his family in a very difficult times. Again, tells you something about how much of an emphasis this country places on people who serve and sacrifice. Probably even more so now that it's an all-volunteer force, because you want to recruit, then you better keep the commitments that you made. And we recruit disproportionately from military families, but if in those families, that all of a sudden mom and dad are talking around the table and it's, well, they promised us this, but they didn't do it, how likely is son or daughter then to follow that, family tradition, if you will? So there's a lot of problems there, but the frustration from a congressional standpoint is not funding, because Congress has been willing to write the check. Veteran spending under Bush doubled, veteran spending under Obama doubled again, veteran spending is going up under President Trump. And Democratic and Republican Congresses have been willing to do it. Now, part of the problem, too, is when I got here a few years ago, more than a few now, there were only 4 million veterans. There's about 25 million in the country right now. Only 4 million of them using veterans facilities. Now it's over 7. Why? Because we've gotten them better. And every time you make them better, the more people that are eligible decide they want to come. So you're sort of always chasing down the road. And we're a lot more sophisticated now about understanding the wounds of war that aren't visible. Things like post-traumatic stress and things like that. Earlier generations did not understand that toll in combat. We do, in a way. And that's increased the size, and the nature of the force has changed. When if you're my age, you talk about veterans, you're talking mostly about men. Now, about 1 out of every 6 or 7 person in the military is female. That's going to affect what you do in terms of veteran services afterwards. You've got to reconfigure what your force is. You're talking about a different kind of soldier. When my dad was in the service, he retired in 1960, only less than 25% of the American military was married, because it was a draftee force. These were young men coming in, serving 2 years, going out. Today, it's about 65%. So guess what? That both affects veterans, but affects everything in terms of what housing on base is going to look like. Got 65% families. There's a bunch of kids. I remember once, this is off the topic, but it's something worth mentioning. Fort Sill Army Post is the home of the field artillery. It's a big training facility. I was going to a school there on post, and these were all little kids. They were all like 1st to 5th grade. So they're, if you've ever been at military schools, they're a little bit different than, I grew up going to them. I mean, there's patriotic things everywhere, and the kids are singing patriotic songs. And, it's really rah-rah. And they were all whipped up. But I walked in, and he said, Congressman, the principal, before you say anything, I want to show you something. And these are the oldest kids, 11 years. Said, how many of you have a parent deployed in, now. That would have been Iraq or Afghanistan in combat effectively. About a third of the hands went up. How many of you have had a parent deployed? Almost every hand went up. Now that means, oldest kid's 11. You're deployed for a year. That means essentially every one of those kids had had one or two parents gone for a year or more out of their life at that point. Think about that in terms of any normal school that you'd go to and ask that same question. I mean, so we really put a tremendous burden on a relatively small number of people. You know, you have to think that about veterans. You have to think that about their extended families. There's an interesting commercial, some woman talking about, I like this company because they treat us like we serve too. Well, I guarantee if you're a military spouse, you did serve. I watched my mother for years. I mean, my dad would always be deployed ahead or whatever. Somebody else packed up the family, moved, and kept everything together. So, I mean, those families, they're pretty special people and the country knows that intuitively, and that's why it's willing to write the check. It just needs to do a better job of delivering the service.
Hello, I'm Elias.
Hi.
In an interview with Oklahoma State Society, you said,
"You guys have really done your research, man. I have to be more careful about what I say."
You said, "My Native American heritage has been profoundly significant in my life, and it's something I was taught to be proud of growing up. My family has always been actively involved in tribal affairs. My great-great-grandfather was the clerk of Chickasaw Supreme Court. My great-grandfather was the treasurer of Chickasaw Nation, and my mom was the very first Native American woman ever elected to Oklahoma State Senate. How do you think your Chickasaw heritage has enriched your perspective and influenced your views?"
Oh, boy, in so many ways. Well, first of all, it's given me a much more nuanced view of American history than probably a lot of people have. And, American history, I think, and I say this, I'm very optimistic about America. I'm very upbeat about our country. I think we're a very special place. But if you're Native American, I'm sure if you're African American, your view is going to be a little bit different because you recognize things have not always been wonderful. Like when my great-great-grandfather was forcibly removed, the appropriate word would be ethnically cleansed from an area where his people had lived for over 500 years. He was 14 years old and sent to some place called Indian Territory. And they lost everything in the process, and then they built it all up again. And then their government were effectively dissolved and their lands opened up to white settlement and broke every treaty they had signed. So I don't have exactly a sunshine and roses view of the past. And that makes me much more empathetic and sympathetic to people that have been in those kind of circumstances themselves or whose families have been. I have a lot of empathy when African Americans talk about, African Americans were here in slavery longer than they've been here in freedom, if you really think about it. So, American history has been tough, but it's moved broadly in the right direction. And so, number one, that. Number two, I think probably, Chickasaws are very proud people and they're very fierce people. They like to brag they never lost a war. I say, well, we just knew when to write a treaty and move. But theoretically, they never have lost a war. Their tenacity, their willingness to hang together, and to even the fact that they're here, there's 65,000 Chickasaws. We're a pretty big tribe. We have about a $3 billion budget. We have about 15,000 employees. We're in over 100 businesses. And you look at where we were 100 years ago and today, extraordinary thing. So it tells me, it teaches me a lot about tenacity and not giving up, but also about what's possible in the United States. Even when you've had a bad knock, you can come back. And so, it just informs your values and view, but it also teaches me I don't have to give up one to be the other. In other words, I don't have to give up being tribal to be a good American or to be a good Oklahoman. They're just another identity. It's part of a larger personal identity, and I don't intend to give it up. I mean, that's a big part of my heritage, and hugely important to me personally, and it's enriched my life, and I see it enriching the lives of other people around us. Not just, I mean, we employ a lot more people than just Chickasaws. We employ a lot of people. We partner in a lot of ways. We have the largest hospital and the Indian-run hospital system in the country. So it's a pretty remarkable place and people. So my mom used to say, because there was a period when if you could pass in terms of color, out, you did, just the way African Americans did historically. If you could pass as not being African American, and if you could, a lot of times they did. A lot of Indians did that in the early 20th century, late 19th century. You look at me, you don't think Indian. I mean, the joke in my family used to be, your brother looks like he could lead a Chickasaw war party. You look like you're one of the guys they brought back. Because I got all the Scotch-Irish, he got all the Indian color and features. Our family never chose to do that and always stayed extremely loyal to its tribe and its traditions and very active in it. So again, it's taught me a lot about the nature of America, good and bad. It's taught me a lot about human qualities. And it's informed who I am, and it's given me a sense of pride and a sense of accomplishment and resilience, quite frankly. Yeah.
Congressman, I know we're at the end of our time, but I'd like to just do a quick lightning round and hear from the students a little bit about what struck you. What did you hear that touched you? Yeah.
I think that what you said about polarization and how it's not it's not just that people on different sides in Congress don't want to work together, but it's also their constituents that are punishing them for not working together, and that some of the a lot of the divide, it's in the people and it's concentrated up here, because I've never really thought of it like that. I think a lot of what you hear and what I've heard is that people in government can't get along and it's all up there, but I guess it's as the people down here you guys are trying to serve, it's important to remember that we need to be willing to make compromises in order for that to be possible.
Yeah, Will.
I really liked what you said early on about keeping the ball moving with regards to policy. We interviewed Panetta a little bit earlier, and he said something almost exactly the same. And it's good to hear that there's more than one politician who's committed to keeping the ball moving, even if you don't get everything you want done, just to make sure that there's progress.
Yep.
I liked how you talked about your mom, and that's been a really big theme throughout our entire DC trip. I mean, it was Mother's Day, the day that I left, and our first interview here was with Admiral Roshan, and every question we asked, he brought in his mother's influence. And this morning we actually went to Nancy Pelosi's seminar on motherhood, and so that was just nice to have a whole theme wrapping it up here.
Who doesn't love their mom?
Go ahead.
I liked what you said about how both in Congress and citizens, civilians, how there's this polarization and that people are in fear of speaking freely about their opinions, in fear of being socially ostracized, which I feel is it prevents people from talking with each other, which is one of the biggest problems probably this country is facing. And I also liked what you said about Veterans' Choice and what you're working on with that.
A quote that struck me was, "Opportunity comes with sacrifice," and we've heard a lot about taking these opportunities and stepping towards it. But I think you brought a new light on it, that it usually comes with sacrifice, and that's a big factor of it.
I remember somebody, a teacher or a coach or somebody said, opportunity usually comes disguised as hard work, and it's quite often true.
Oh yeah, I really like the thing you're talking about where the division of our country starts with the people and comes to a point up here, and it's not as we may see the media portray that it all comes from here and spans down. I thought that was really interesting.
Well, think of the Civil War. I mean, and not that I'm predicting we're on a civil war, but do you really think the arguments about slavery and secession or whatever started here, or did they start in the country and move to here? That's usually what happens. I mean, this is not where change starts, it's usually where it culminates, good or bad.
One thing I found really interesting and hadn't really thought about before was how you were talking about the overlap between the Democratic and Republican Party views and how that's been lost now. So there's no overlay, and therefore it makes it hard to compromise.
Yeah.
And that really was really fascinating to me.
So I can't tell you how much it means to me personally that you take time out. We're not from your district, but we're certainly fans. That doesn't get votes, but it really is a public service for you to take time out of your schedule and come and talk with us. And it gives a perspective, I think, that, especially in California, that we need about understanding that it's not we don't have one issue candidates. There's many, many issues. We're on different places in all of them according to our constituencies, but that we have good people, principled people who happen to disagree on things. But the whole notion that the cornerstone is empathy and service, you know, and actually trying to work things out is a valuable thing, I think, for people in the country to know.
Thank you.